Hello, and thank you for joining us for episode 51 of the Aviation News Talk podcast, where we bring you general aviation news and relevant information that pilots like you can hopefully put to use. Today, I'm going to talk about a long cross-country flight that I made last week to bring a brand new SR22T from the Cirrus Delivery Center in Knoxville, Tennessee, back to San Jose, California. And to help tell the story, I've asked Chuck Price, who accompanied me on the trip, to join us and give his impressions of the trip, which covered over 1,900 miles in a day and a half. Plus, we'll talk about the experience that Cirrus creates for a buyer when they come back to Knoxville to pick up their new plane. Now stand by, because this episode starts now. Welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk about general aviation. I'm Max Trescott, and I'm here to educate and inform you as a pilot or student pilot, and occasionally have a laugh or two along the way. And I'll try and share my over 40 years of experience as a certificated pilot, author of the G1000 Glass Cockpit Handbook, and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year, where I got to represent all 96,000 CFIs here in the U.S. And I'm also a specialist in Cirrus aircraft like the SR20 and SR22. Now, if you're joining us for the first time, we have a weekly show that focuses on general aviation news, and in each show I discuss a particular pilot skill. But occasionally we also drop in an interview episode like this one today. Now, longtime listeners know we don't have advertisers, but we do have some expenses, and I appreciate the monthly contributions from our 90 Patreons who donate each month via credit card. In the weekly show, I read the name of every new person who donates to the show, and during the first show of each month, I read the names of our biggest supporters who contribute at least $20 a month. Now, you can make a contribution to the show of as little as $2 a month, and the cost will be billed to your credit card each month. And while you're on the Patreon site, check out the many general aviation stories I've posted on the blog. Some stories are available for everyone to read, and a few are only viewable by our Patreon supporters. You can get to the Patreon page by going to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, or just go to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Help the Show at the top of the page. Now, earlier today, I talked with Chuck Price, who accompanied me on the trip to bring the SR22T from Knoxville, Tennessee, back to San Jose, California, and here's that interview. Now let me tell you about Chuck Price. Chuck is originally from North Carolina, but now he lives here in Silicon Valley in Northern California. He's worked for a variety of high-tech firms, and he's currently the vice president of product for Too Simple. That's a startup firm that's working on technology to enable self-driving trucks. And until just a couple of months ago, he hadn't flown in over 12 years. But in the past, he flew Cessnas, Citabrias, Moonis that he rented at both the Reed Hillview and Palo Alto airports in the San Francisco Bay Area. He holds a private certificate for gliders and single-engine aircraft and has an instrument rating. Altogether, he has about 600 hours of total time. Now, a couple of months ago, he contacted me and said that he wanted to get back into flying and that he wanted to do that by getting checked out in a Cirrus SR20. He recently finished that checkout, and he told me that someday he'd like to buy a new Cirrus. So when a local buyer bought a new Cirrus but couldn't go back to the factory to pick it up, he asked me to get it for him, and I invited Chuck to travel back to the factory so that he could get some insight into what it's like to buy a Cirrus. And I also invited him along because I think it's safer having two pilots in the cockpit, especially for longer trips. Well, Chuck, I'd like to officially welcome you to the Aviation News Talk podcast. We're very excited to have you here.
Well, thanks for having me, Max. I'm looking forward to this.
Well, I'm sure that you have probably had the same experience that I've had in life, which is that sometimes when we're excited about something new, the experience doesn't quite live up to our expectations. So tell me candidly, how did this trip measure up to your expectations?
Well, I can say honestly that this far exceeded my expectations, and I think we're going to get into some of this during the conversation, but I was thrilled by every moment of this experience. It was definitely worth it.
Well, I want you to know that I could have sold that seat multiple times. Not that you paid to be in the seat, but there were multiple people who really wanted to be on that trip. So yeah, it's kind of special to get a chance to do that. Well, so let me just set this up. You and I flew commercially into Knoxville on Wednesday afternoon. You got there about 2:30 in the afternoon, and I got there later about 6:30 p.m. Tell us what happened after you arrived on Wednesday afternoon.
It was a great arrival, great trip. I was contacted on my arrival by Brandy Kennedy, who is the sales executive that was responsible for this particular sale. She came to the hotel and picked me up in a beautiful, gigantic Audi SUV, drove me to the Cirrus building, which was a few steps away, really, and then gave me the keys to the car and said, use this car while you're here. So it was, it started and ended with royal treatment. They gave me some gifts. They brought me into the gift shop and let me shop a while, introduced me to a number of folks, and then, to my surprise, introduced me to the founder of Cirrus, Dale, the co-founder, and we chatted a bit and promised to chat some more the next day. So I was on cloud nine from the outset. And later, when I got back to my hotel, I found that they had snuck into my room and left another gift on my bed, a hat, a Cirrus hat. Just wonderful.
Well, we both came back away better clothed than when we arrived there. So, yes, I
absolutely.
I was happy to get a jacket and a hat, and went on to buy a shirt and another kind of pullover shirt. So let's see. Afterwards, you and I went out to dinner that night, and then the next morning we checked out of our hotel and drove all of a tenth of a mile to get to the Cirrus office building. I mean, I think people should know that Knoxville is just incredibly well suited for this. There are probably 5 gates at the airport. It's a 2-minute walk to the hotel, and then Cirrus is a few minutes walk away from there. But anyway, we spent some time with the delivery team in the morning, and then they packed us back up into the car for all of a 3-minute drive back to the delivery hangar. Now, tell us what happened after we arrived at the building and we're still in the car.
This was really a treat. The door rolled up, and the car drove into a darkened hangar that was they were playing music and they were projecting lights into the hangar. It was an incredible celebratory moment. We got out of the car. The plane was dressed and ready for us with literally a red carpet leading us to the plane, and they congratulated us on our new purchase. We both sort of sheepishly had to remind them that we were just there to drive the plane, to fly the plane home. We didn't buy it, but they treated us as if we were the buyer. It was a spectacular experience.
Well, it was kind of funny to have everybody walk up to us and say, congratulations, congratulations. But Dale Klappmeyer was there, and also Patrick Waddick. He's the president of Innovation and Operations at Cirrus, and he's responsible for research and development, engineering, and program management, manufacturing operations, and quite a bit else. So we had two of the top guys there greeting us, which was kind of fun. So then we went out and actually did a little over an hour, I guess, test flying the aircraft. Do you want to tell us about the test flight?
Well, I think I'm going to pass on some of that to you because I sat in the back seat. I will say the most interesting part of that experience for me was flying for the first time with a Bose A20 headset. And given that I was considering buying a new ANR headset, that was a great experience for me. Otherwise, I think you're best suited to talk about what we did during that test flight.
Yeah, so I chose to sit in the right seat while the delivery pilot did the flying, and I confirmed with him that that's pretty unusual. Most of the time, people coming in to buy the airplane want to do that test flight themselves. But the reason I had him do it was because it gave me all kinds of time to just sit there and take notes and, watch how he was flying and observe, and it really was more productive and effective for me to let him do all the flying. But I had a page-long list, almost single-spaced, of different things I wanted to check out in the aircraft to make sure that they worked. And, it's not unusual when you pick up something brand new that maybe there's, something that had some infant mortality and failed. So you want to catch that early. And we didn't find anything in the aircraft that wasn't working. But we did check the air conditioning and made sure that was working. Check the heater, which we didn't need immediately, but we did later in the trip. Checked out the VORs, dialed up both of those, GPSs, checked every mode on the autopilot, of which there are many. Talked on both radios, both of those were working. Checked out the synthetic vision, and by the way, there's a new feature on synthetic vision, which I had not heard of, which was great, which is a database of wires located near airports. So for high-tension towers and stuff like that, you actually get a line of, if you're really close to them, yellow, or if you're very low close to them, red wires shown on the synthetic vision, which I think is really awesome. We checked out the transponder, we checked all the lights, checked the level key, which is that blue button you push and suddenly it makes the aircraft level again. Checked the play button on the audio panel, which we used a number of times during the trip to play back ATC transmissions to kind of verify what exactly was it they said. And we checked out the envelope stability protection, which basically will help right the aircraft if you start to get too steep in bank or too steep in pitch. Checked out the weather. This aircraft had both XM weather as well as the Garmin Connects, which is a satellite-based weather. Made sure the terrain page was working, the fuel range ring was working. Ran the TKS, since this was a FIKI, flight into known icing aircraft, and made sure that that was all flowing nicely on the wings. Checked out our electronic checklist that were in the airplane. Checked out our EVS camera, which I recall now, I don't think we used the entire flight, did we? We never used the camera to take a look outside.
We did not, and I sort of kicked myself later because it was one aspect of that particular plane that I did want to experience, and I didn't remember to even think about it until we were done.
Well, we only had 14 hours. We were just too. There was certainly time to have checked it out on the way back, but we were doing other kinds of things. I'll just mention in passing that it's an infrared camera, and I found that it's probably most useful at night when you're coming into an airport because the runway will be hotter than everything surrounding it, and so it's going to show up white on the camera. It makes it really, really, really easy to pick out a runway, especially if you're at an unfamiliar airport. Most of our flying was in the daytime, and the night landings we did were into really large airports where we had no trouble picking out the airport, so we didn't really need it.
It may be worth pointing out that entire test flight was done on an IFR flight plan in IMC conditions, test flight.
Yep.
So many of these maneuvers that you were doing in IMC.
Yeah, and we were in and out of the clouds, and so it looks to me like Knoxville is very familiar with these test flights. They were very generous in terms of giving us everything we asked and giving us areas to play around in and do all this testing, so it worked out really, really well. We flew a couple of approaches. We flew the ILS 23 into the Tyson Airport. That's the big one at Knoxville, and also flew the missed approach. What's cool about the Cirrus is that you don't have to disconnect the autopilot for the missed approach. You can just press the Togo button and push the throttle forward, which we did, and that all worked out well. Checked out our Cirrus XM radio to listen to see that that was receiving the radio. I would say that's most of what we did. We flew one additional approach into landing, which was the RNAV GPS approach, as I recall. And that was about it. Oh, I know what we discovered. We found out that the satellite phone was not working, and that's because it hadn't been registered. Later in the day, they put in the registration information, and so we actually made phone calls on the trip back for the satellite phone, so that was fun. All right, so after that, we came back and we had lunch, and then I had them pull the engine cowling so that I could inspect the inside of the engine compartment. Now, I wasn't really looking for anything in particular, but I just wanted to personally see that nothing looked loose inside or not quite right before the trip, and I kind of thought our buyer might ask us later, did you pull the cowling and look inside? To which I could then truthfully say, yes, we did. So after pulling the cowling, we went back to the Cirrus office building, and I was in the CAPS parachute simulator, and you were out in the hall talking for nearly an hour. Tell us a little bit about your conversation with Dale Klappmeyer.
Well, first, I have to say, it was a real dilemma. Do I go into the CAPS simulator and pull the big red handle, which I've been wanting to do since I've started flying the Cirrus, just to see what it feels like? Or do I talk to the co-founder of Cirrus for an hour? I decided to go with the co-founder of Cirrus, and they did let me pull the handle later. So that was, so I got both things done. But Dale and I had a wonderful conversation for an hour. Being involved in building autonomous vehicles, I am quite curious about how other companies that are building safety critical systems like the Cirrus, how they think about safety, how they approach safety. And we spent a substantial amount of time talking about how safety evolved at Cirrus. And he said that evolved is really the right word because they sort of moved into this piecewise. It started with his brother Alan's mid-air collision, which fortunately Alan survived. Unfortunately, the other plane's occupants did not survive. Alan was able to bring his plane with a severed right wing outer portion back to the airport with some very fortunate maneuvers. And according to Dale, Alan landed and said, there has to be a better way. There has to be something more. And from there, they developed the whole aircraft parachute. They have continued to work on safety systems since.
And let me jump in quickly to say that Dale shared a few of the things they're working on in the future, and Chuck talked about some of that, but I don't think that was meant for public consumption, so I've gone ahead and deleted that here. We'll wait for Cirrus to announce the new things that they're working on when they're actually in production.
So it was quite an interesting conversation.
All right, great. So finally we headed down to the delivery hangar to start our trip back. It was probably 2:30 in the afternoon. I know we took off somewhere around 3 o'clock. And I had previously put together a briefing, which we ran through, I think even before we got to the beginning of the flight. We may have talked about this a day or two ahead of time. And I talked about risk management and what the highest risk for us might be along the flight. And I said that fatigue might be one of them, and that our rule going forward for the flight would be that either person could say that we're done for the day. I think on these long trips, it's really easy to continue on to the point of exhaustion, and that's when kind of dumb stuff starts to happen. So we didn't want any dumb stuff to happen. I also mentioned, since we were probably going to be IFR and you'd be doing a lot of the flying, that I wanted to make sure that we didn't get violated for any altitude busts, and basically said that if we reach plus or minus 100 feet from our altitude, I would call altitude, and at 200 feet, I would be pushing or pulling to correct. Also mentioned that we'd probably want to do research on noise abatement for the different airports that we're going in and out of. Other risk factors I thought might be turbulence or other weather, and we talked about how if we're going to be in turbulence, we might want to slow the aircraft in anticipation of the turbulence, which we did on a few occasions during the trip, and also mentioned for emergencies such as an engine loss below 1,000 feet, just assume that I would take the controls and that you would take the radios and assist in any way. And essentially, we decided we would have a sterile cockpit and cruise up till about 15 nautical miles away from the airport. So by that, we'd only talk about things that were related to the flight and not be chit-chatting about other things. We would call out that CAPS was available when we were 600 feet above the ground, and the flaps would also come up about that time as well. And let's see. Oh, of course, I was going to be making all the takeoffs and the landings because that was a request by the buyer, a request I certainly had to honor. But Chuck did all the other flying except for the landings and takeoffs. Now, it was about 60 degrees as we left Knoxville, which was pretty nice. It was warmer than I thought it would be in Knoxville. But we didn't make it quite as far as we thought we were going to make it that day. Tell people about that first leg leaving Knoxville.
Yeah, it was quite interesting. It was IFR conditions, so we had to file an IFR flight plan. We had discussed either Tulsa or Oklahoma City as a terminating point. So we planned for Oklahoma City with decision that if we didn't make it that far, we'd probably end up in Tulsa. We took off into headwinds that were far beyond what we expected. We initially had about 50 knots. They then increased to over 60 knots along the route. The wonderful thing about the SR22 is the perspective system keeps us advised of our remaining fuel on board. So we were able to tell pretty quickly that we weren't going to make it to either of those cities. In fact, it wasn't clear we would make it to the state of Oklahoma at all. So about mid-flight, we started discussing alternatives, and where we ended up was Springfield, Missouri, which was a perfectly fine place to end up. It just wasn't on our course. But it was quite turbulent and extremely strong headwinds.
So I was thinking the ceilings, as I recall, were maybe just a couple thousand feet above the ground. I think our cruise altitude was 6,000. Does that sound right?
That's correct. We were at 6,000 feet, and we were monitoring the winds aloft and determined that we did not want to be any higher than 6,000. And we really didn't want to be any lower than 6,000 because of the turbulence. It was just going to get worse going lower.
Yeah, and so that was kind of the alternative I was just going to mention. We could have decided to stay low, maybe below the clouds, but that was not the kind of terrain where you want to be doing that. We did later stay low, but we were over flat terrain. It's kind of hilly in Tennessee, and they do have obstacles like towers, and it just didn't make sense for us to be down low, bumping along, in the terrain and obstacles and turbulence. So we ended up above the first layer of clouds, which was a little bit smoother. Now, we were really lucky because the temperatures were about 60, which meant that at 6,000, we were not in icing. So we were still above the 0 degrees at that altitude. And that turned out to be really handy. Let's see. So we got to Springfield, Missouri, and we took the hotel shuttle to a hotel there. They had a couple of choices at the FBO. The FBO was great there. I think it's run by the city, but they offered a couple of hotels, and they mentioned one that was near some restaurants. And so we chose that one, and we walked over to the Walmart where we found a Subway shop, and they made us some sandwiches for the next day, because as I mentioned before on the show, I like to have my lunch with me in the airplane when we take off, because I can just save so much time. Otherwise, you can spend a whole lot of time looking for lunch on these trips at a fuel stop. So you and I agreed to meet at 6:15 in the morning for breakfast so that we could take the 7 a.m. hotel shuttle to the airport. Now, in fact, we were ready to go early, so you called a Lyft car to take us to the airport. But what did we discover when we got outside that day?
I think all the winds that we were facing blew in some incredibly freezing cold weather. So a front had obviously gone through that night. It had rained, and it was bitter cold outside. As opposed to when we arrived, it was pleasant. It was in the 60s. So that was a bit of a shock. There was a cloud layer, and it was literally freezing. So that meant ice. And we had to think very seriously about how we were going to conduct the next leg. As I recall, we did pretty detailed scan of with ForeFlight of where the winds were, where the clouds were, and we concluded that since our next stop, well, we were discussing a variety of options. We finally landed on Amarillo, Texas as our next stop. But we realized that going straight to Amarillo would put us in headwinds. So we determined by spending some time that if we went north first and then went down, we would be in tailwinds as long as we stayed low. So that's what we did.
And I would say that probably it's not the winds that was the primary consideration. We had a line of weather that was just on the border of our direct path to Amarillo. And so by staying a little bit, exactly. So by staying a little bit north of that line, it kept us out of the weather. Now, we spent over an hour at the airport. I thought, hey, this will be a no-brainer. We'll hop in the airplane and we go because we know pretty much where we're headed. But we spent over an hour analyzing the different options. Part of the problem was it was virtually freezing at the surface. I think it was 33 at the airport when we got there. And so it had rained lightly over the night. And so you wisely said, hey, let's check and make sure there's no water frozen on the aircraft, no ice on the airplane. So we were really lucky. It was just barely melted. So there was no ice on the airplane. The ceiling at that time, as I recall, was about 1,800 above the ground. So we faced the possibility of staying below the clouds but being really low, or climbing up through them and hoping that we would be on top. But if we weren't, then, of course, we would be picking up ice along the way. Now, granted, we had FIKI in this aircraft, flight into known icing capability, but we didn't have full tanks. They were probably about 75% full. They had not been fully topped off before we left. So we really didn't want to get into icing for an extended period of time. Now, as we sat and looked at all these different options, which also included, I think, looking at an airport in Colorado, we figured by flying to Colorado, we might then later make a decision whether to go north along Interstate 80 or go south along Albuquerque and Phoenix. But ultimately, as we were spending time doing our flight planning, that first layer of clouds above us started to break up sufficiently that we could see that the next layer was really high cirrus. It was probably up at 18,000 feet or something like that. So it became pretty clear that as soon as we got above that light broken area, we were going to be in pretty good shape. So we initially took off to the northwest, and we probably traveled, 10, 15 minutes in that direction before it became clear that it would be easy to climb up on top of this layer. And we traveled, as I recall, at 4,000 feet for most of the way to Amarillo, Texas. Now, at 4,000 feet, we had a tailwind, which was averaged about 15 knots. It peaked at 20 knots. Do you remember what the winds were like slightly above that?
Oh, yeah. We were in a tube of tailwind. Anything above I think even just going up to 5,000 feet, maybe 4,500, we were in a headwind. And as I recall, going lower, we were in a headwind. I think we found a layer that was tailwind, sort of a little miraculous spot for us that lasted pretty much all the way to Amarillo.
Yeah, my recollection is that our true airspeed at 4,000 was about 165 knots. Our tailwind averaged about 15 knots, and that usually we were seeing about 100 to 182 knots almost the entire trip. Now, at one point, we started to climb up, and I don't remember why, but I think we wanted to just see, hey, what are the winds like? But we didn't climb more than 1,000 feet before we said, nope, we're done with that, started heading back down. But I remember we looked at the winds aloft, and once you got up into the teens, the headwind was 70 to 80 knots. So it became really clear that was not an option. So we were lucky that we were able to stay really low because the terrain was so flat, and that really gave us a nice unexpected tailwind, which made it possible to complete the trip in the same day.
Yeah, it was sort of amazing conditions. I can't add much.
So we made really great time to our first stop in Amarillo, Texas. We could have gone further, but we really wanted to stop there so that we could then have a really long leg after that. Now, we did have one small problem as we were coming into Amarillo. We could hear that Amarillo Approach was handling an American Airlines flight that had a medical emergency on board. And that plane was high, so he was given a vector, and Approach was trying to get him down. And so they gave us a vector for a very wide downwind to land behind the American Airlines flight. So, Chuck, you'd been flying up until then, and that's when I took over to do the landing as the buyer had requested. Now, we had planned to load the visual approach into the flight management system because I wanted to demo that capability for you. That was new in Cirrus in 2017. So you load it just like an instrument approach, except it's a visual approach, and the autopilot will fly it to virtually the ground. It creates a glide slope and so on. But then they gave us vectors for this really wide downwind, so it didn't look like we'd be able to do that. But then later, Approach told me to turn base, which I did, and I was able to re-enable the visual approach, and we let the autopilot fly the plane down to perhaps 300 or 400 feet above the ground. And that's where I disconnected the autopilot and made the landing. Now, here was the weird part. As we taxied off the runway and waited, I was surprised that Tower had not told us to call ground. So I called the Tower, and I got a reply from them that I was still on the approach frequency. And that's when we both realized that we had never switched to the Tower and we had landed without a clearance. So when we did call ground, they told us that we had never switched to Tower. And I think I said something like, we were just talking about that, and we don't remember ever hearing Approach switch us to the Tower. And ground was pretty nice about it, and they gave us our taxi instructions. So I then started hitting the play button a whole number of times so that we could get back to that last transmission that was addressed to us by Amarillo. And it said, turn base and contact Tower. I was like, oh, man. That's when I really felt like we had royally screwed up. We both missed that call. Yeah, looking back at that, you and I talked about that at length while we were having lunch at TAC Air, which is the FBO. We were there. What do you remember about our conversation about that missed call?
Well, I remember my emotions. I was quite frustrated with myself that I could miss a call like that. I recall thinking through it and thinking on final that something wasn't quite right. The approach was stable, and it was, a typical excellently flown landing, but something didn't feel right on final. And I realized when we were on the ground that what didn't feel right is I didn't recall us getting a clear to land. But I thought about that, and I thought, well, we must have gotten a clear to land because you landed the plane and you're a great pilot. So it was just stunning to me that we both missed this, and it was disconcerting to me that I missed it. I felt very bad, and you coached me through that a bit in our conversation, saying, it helps no one to beat yourself up about it, just learn from it.
Yep.
And I think we both did. And we had some conversation about things that led us to sort of not take more immediate action. So why didn't I speak up on final? Why didn't I react more more vocally to my concerns that something didn't feel right. And that was probably the most interesting part of the conversation. And part of it, I think we concluded, was because we had this sterile cockpit rule that we had established and things were going fine. And this was just this lurking feeling. And I chose, wrongly, I think, not to articulate my concern. But maybe you can talk from your perspective on that.
Yeah, you're recalling some things that I had forgotten, and I'll mention a couple of other things here as well. Yeah, I agree. You were beating yourself up more than I was, and I was at least as culpable, if not more so. But my belief is that it never pays to kind of beat ourselves up for mistakes. We all make mistakes. The real question is, what can we learn from it? And I think you and I learned a lot from it, and I'm hoping some of the listeners can learn a little bit from it as well from our discussion of it. I had forgotten the part about the sterile cockpit, and I think what you and I discussed was, sterile cockpit doesn't mean don't say anything. It means confine your conversation to relevant things related to the flight itself. So you definitely don't want people to be inhibited from saying something that's related to the flight. But I also get that, if you just had this nagging feeling that, something wasn't right, it's pretty hard to articulate that and, have me respond and go, really? Why do you feel that way? But I think when I think back, I believe that my interest in loading the visual approach to demonstrate that to you was a contributing factor. I was excited that, oh yeah, great, now I can reload the visual and we can make that happen. And that occurred essentially while we were on base. And that was about the time that approach told us to turn base and contact tower. Another thing I think that contributed was we switched responsibilities on downwind, which we had planned and certainly shouldn't have been a problem. But because of that, I had not paid attention to the frequencies that you had loaded. And so I actually remember looking up at the frequencies at one point, and I just kind of assumed, okay, that's tower, that's approach and so on. But since I hadn't loaded them, I didn't know what they were, and I hadn't really paid attention to what they were, which meant I couldn't tell just by looking up and identifying them, hey, were we on tower at that particular point in time? Now, a lot of people will verify whether they're cleared to land by, throwing some switch in the cockpit. I hear a lot of people say that they'll turn on the landing light as an indication that they've been cleared to land. That doesn't really work for me because here in the San Francisco Bay Area, I travel with the landing light on almost 100% of the time because we're such a densely populated area that we want to be visible as possible to other aircraft. And so I don't really have a switch that I throw to indicate that I've been cleared to land, but it's made me think about whether I might want to come up with some other way to indicate that I've been cleared to land. And of course, anytime anyone has any doubt about whether they're clear to land, it makes a lot of sense just to speak up and ask, which I didn't do because it didn't occur to me that there was anything amiss. The other factor I'm wondering is, fatigue. Were you at all tired that time of day? I certainly was.
I didn't feel fatigued. I think possibly it played a role, but I didn't feel it. My feeling was that we had several things going on. We were in the middle of making the handoff. Probably we could have come up with a more comprehensive handoff procedure. But even that, we were busy, we were turning base. We were on downwind turning base. And there was traffic. He had been talking to another plane and trying to sequence us in. So I don't think I would credit that to fatigue at that point.
And we were flying a pretty wide base. I bet by the time we turned base, we were easily 3 to 4 miles from the airport. So it wasn't like we didn't have a whole lot of time. There was nothing rushed about the whole process. But again, I think I was just distracted by, demonstrating, wow, this wonderful, visual approach. So really kind of for me highlights the need to focus on the most important things, which are, well, I hate to say that radio communication is the most important thing, but it is an important factor when people are landing. So anyway, I think we both learned a lot from that. But let's talk about Amarillo. I've been there probably a half dozen times over the years. What were some of the fun kinds of things we saw while we were there on the ground?
Oh, well, it is a wonderful airport. There's a high military presence. I suppose they're just transiting to different bases. And this is a fuel stopover point, but in the lunchroom were patches from at least 20 different squadrons of Air Force and National Guard and Marines. And so it seems everyone flies into that place. It's a wonderful place to see some exotic aircraft. I'm pretty sure we saw a CIA aircraft because it was all white with a little American flag and nothing else. And some very large planes, including a C-17 that was doing touch and goes, which became significant for us on departure. We were told to, be cautious of wake turbulence on takeoff, which also led to another interesting discussion about the style of takeoff that one should consider in a Cirrus in the face of wake turbulence potential. So maybe you want to talk about that a little bit.
Well, I think the first part about wake turbulence was we were talking about, since this aircraft had done a touch and go, where would be theoretically the safe area, to depart. And, for an aircraft taking off, well, you'd want to be able to take off before its point of rotation. For an aircraft landing, you would want to be rotating beyond the point where it touched down. But the problem, and this I don't think it's talked about often in wake turbulence discussions, is if you have an aircraft that's doing a touch and go, they've pretty much contaminated the entire runway with wake turbulence. So there was no real safe area for us. We just sat and waited several minutes. My recollection is it was a full 2 minutes after they took off before we were cleared to take off, and we took our time. It was about 3 minutes before I started adding full power to go down the runway. So we left a lot of time for the runway to clear itself of wake turbulence.
It should be worth noting that even on our departure, the next aircraft that lined up, they were still calling caution for wake turbulence past 3 minutes. He gave them a much larger number. So the tower was very concerned.
Hmm. And the other thing you mentioned was I like doing a short field takeoff technique where I hold the short field takeoff airspeed all the way up to 600 feet where the CAPS parachute becomes available. And I like that because it gets me to that parachute safe deployment altitude faster. I've timed this many times, and doing that, it'll save, probably 5-6 seconds easily in an SR22 and more like 11-12 seconds in an SR20. And that danger zone, before you're able to get to either 500 or 600 feet above ground, depending on the model of aircraft, is where you really are at the greatest risk because you're too low to safely pull the CAPS parachute. And I should just mention here for folks who aren't familiar with the deployment sequence, when you pull the parachute in a Cirrus, initially the aircraft pitches down 60 degrees. And if you are low when you pull the parachute, you're going to be hitting the ground pretty much, straight in. And that's often fatal. So there have been people who have pulled parachutes at very low altitude. And it's something that pilots have to be thinking about when they're departing in a Cirrus. Everybody, I think, knows that the parachute can help them in just about every possible situation once they're above that minimum altitude for pulling. But if you choose to pull it below, you might actually make a bad situation even worse. So anyway, your point, I think, was that we might want to, have some extra margin above stall speed by climbing out at a higher speed?
Yeah, my feeling was that when you have the possibility of especially something as extreme as wake turbulence, taking off at VY, having a little more speed gets you a little further away from your stall and gives you a little more positive control. So my feeling in that case, it was actually quite a long runway and open spaces around, that maybe best choice for that particular case would be to fly it, climb at VY.
Yep.
So we had a nice discussion in the cockpit on departure about that.
Yeah, I think your point is well taken. You and I fly mostly out of a pretty darn short runway, 2,500 feet at Palo Alto. Actually, it's just a little bit shorter than 2,500 feet, whereas we had miles and miles of runway at Amarillo. Very, very different situation, and so the risk management might be a little bit different flying out of that airport. Well, so let's talk about the next leg, which turned out to probably be the most challenging leg of the flight. I had suggested that we flight plan to Prescott, Arizona, because its field elevation is over 5,000 feet, and that saves a lot of time that you would otherwise spend climbing or descending all the way down to virtually sea level, for example, at some airports like Lake Havasu, which isn't terribly far from there. Talk about the challenge on this leg. What made this leg particularly tough for us?
Well, we had weather over Albuquerque. We were trying to fly VFR. We were flying low because of the winds, trying to stay below clouds as much as we could. And our concern was, because it was cold, that there would be snow and ice that we might be facing. And particularly daunting might be, ice in the clouds if we ended up having to go up IFR into the clouds. So we tried to stay VFR. And in fact, surprising to me, we managed to stay VFR through the entire system that we flew through. We were between the clouds and the ground for a while, and then as we got closer to the mountains, of course, the terrain was rising, and we were tracking that along our path. And as we got near Albuquerque, we had to start climbing. And we managed to climb up sufficiently high to clear the mountains. We were at about 11,000. We got ourselves on oxygen. And I should point out, it was a wise choice on your part that we broke out the oxygen gear at Amarillo before we departed, so that we were sure we were ready if we had to climb up to any sort of oxygen level. So we were ready to go with that. And as we climbed, we found ourselves between two very daunting layers, a thick, solid overcast below us that we had convinced ourselves was ice laden, and a layer right above us that we were certain was also ice. So we managed, I think we probably had 1,500 feet or so, maybe 2,000. I don't know. I don't want to try to estimate the vertical, but it felt like we were flying in a tunnel through Albuquerque. During that period, we had concluded that it might behoove us to go on an IFR plan. So we called ATC and asked for an IFR clearance to Prescott, and they never delivered it. So eventually, we did pop out into clear air, and we no longer needed it. So we didn't bother them anymore with that request.
Yeah, so I recall that we started out fairly low. I'm going to guess somewhere around 6,500 feet. I don't recall exactly what it was. And then as we saw a line of clouds start to form above us, in front of us, we climbed up to, I think initially 9,500 feet. And then later we went to 10,500 feet. And then we started creeping up as needed to stay above the cloud layer below us. And at one point we were definitely above 11,000. I don't recall if we made it to about 11,200. My experience has been that flying in that part of the Southwest through the New Mexico and Phoenix, Arizona area, that the air traffic controllers are pretty flexible about altitudes, which indeed was the case with us. There was never once a time when they said, hey, you're not at a standard, altitude for VFR in that particular direction. And so that helps a lot in terms of being able to dodge the clouds a little bit. Now, our XM weather, the next rad showed a lot of precipitation and ice pretty much to the south of us and a little bit to the north of us around Santa Fe. So we would like to have deviated further to the north if we could possibly have done that. But there were mountains around Santa Fe, and it looked like that was just unfortunately not going to be a viable route because it did show some ice there. So we were able to get through the Albuquerque area pretty easily. My recollection is we must have initially asked for flight following to Albuquerque, because as we got closer to Albuquerque, they started giving us instructions for landing, at which point we updated them and said, no, we'd like to continue on to Prescott. And I think we did that just to have an option if things didn't look well. We could go ahead and stop at that point. But things were great, and we continued on. And it was nice as we got toward what I think was probably the western border of New Mexico and started getting into Arizona, because the skies just cleared in the last 45 minutes or so into Prescott was really, really nice flying.
It was great. We had beautiful views of Sedona on the approach, and then a very nice approach into Prescott, which has a surprising number of airplanes flying around it because they do flight training there.
Yes, Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University has their western campus at Prescott, Arizona, and there are a lot of those airplanes in the pattern there. You can tell because many of them end in the call sign ER for Embry-Riddle. And we were not able to immediately join the downwind. They kept us to the south of the airport before they brought us in. Now, I've been to Prescott a number of times. I picked up a Cirrus there last May, and it's just a great airport for getting in and out quickly. The people at the FBO were very friendly, as were all the fuel handlers as well too. And let's see, that's the place where I remember to open the oil door. So often I forgot to do that on some of these turns. And what I found with the Cirrus is that if you have a short layover, perhaps you're on the ground for anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour, it helps to, as soon as you land, open the hatch on the top of the cowling, which gives you access to the oil, because that way you can vent a lot of heat out of the engine compartment, and that reduces the amount of vaporization of fuel in the fuel lines, which makes it much easier to start the aircraft. We also added oil there. Of course, we were still using mineral oil because we were still in the break-in period of the engine. The instructions from the manufacturer are to use mineral oil for the first 25 hours of break-in of a new engine. And that break-in involves essentially honing down the insides of the cylinders. I learned recently that when the new cylinders are produced, they actually have a very tiny crosshatch pattern on the inside of the cylinder. And that mineral oil helps wear that cross-hatching down and helps seat the pistons and the rings into the cylinder, so you get a nice fit for the engine. So let's see. We finally got ready to leave for San Jose, and we knew that it was going to be about 3 hours from there to San Jose, which meant we would be landing around 7:30 p.m. or so, which was not bad considering we had about a 1,450-mile day, something like that. So that was certainly the easiest leg of the trip because there were virtually no clouds en route, and it was very smooth, no turbulence at all. But what do you remember about that leg?
I remember because we were crossing some mountains, and these were ranges of mountains that were, perpendicular to our course with deep valleys between. As we were approaching, I kept feeling that we were below the tops of the mountains, but I would review the PFD, the synthetic vision, the terrain, everything said we were well clear. But my internal flags were saying we're too low. And I came to realize that this was not because we were too low. It was because I was used to a different sort of cowling. The Cirrus console is much lower in your sight line. And so I felt the mountains were higher than they really were. So it was something I had to adjust to. It was quite interesting.
Yeah, I agree. I think the shape of the cowling as you look out the window is different than other aircraft. And I think that's partially why when we fly an approach to landing in the Cirrus, that the nose appears to be pitched down lower than it would be in other aircraft. It might not be any lower, but for sure the cowling is a little smaller and tighter. So it certainly exaggerates the view and makes it look like we're a little bit steeper. Let's see. Oh, so I remember a couple things. As we got toward the Tehachapi's, we ended up deciding to climb because I think at that point we had headwinds that were probably 10 or 20 knots. And my concern was that as we reached the Tehachapi's, those winds might accelerate and that we might find severe turbulence. So in my 40 years of flying, I've had severe turbulence 4 times, and once was right there. So I'm particularly sensitive to, how the winds can accelerate sometimes over these mountain passes and, really beat you up when you get on the other side.
Yeah, I recall that too. And I do recall that during that phase of the flight, that any time I've done mountain flying in my past, I have chosen to fly as high as I could stand because I don't like flying in and around the mountains. And the nice thing about this SR22T is you pick the altitude and it goes there. So we had no problem climbing when we needed to get to an altitude that made us both feel comfortable.
And I was just scanning through some of the pictures here, and we shot some nice sunset photos as we were headed west into California. Do you want to tell them about my crazy technique?
Oh, this is wonderful. Out of the blue, Max pulled down the sunshade and shot an image with his iPhone of the sun through the sunshade with the instruments not through the sunshade. So we got a nicely exposed image of both the sunset and the interior without any, the normal darkness you would get just trying to shoot the sunset directly. It turned out to be a gorgeous shot. So I stole one myself with the same with the same thing and posted it on Facebook and got lots of comments.
Yeah, I'm just going through these right now, and they are pretty cool. Because yes, you're absolutely right. If normally if you'd taken that shot, the camera would have, the aperture would have shut down to account for the bright sunlight, and then you'd barely be able to see anything in the cockpit. But here you got a nicely exposed picture, both in the top half showing the sunset through the visor, and in the bottom half where you can clearly see everything on both displays. So it was a pretty nice kind of composite picture. So that worked out well.
And I think the most important thing that we did on that flight was on approach to San Jose, we turned on the ice lights to make sure we had no ice on our approach to San Jose, California.
I was looking at that picture as well too. Yeah, and we turn those on just to kind of see, well, what does this look like at night with the ice lights on? And basically they light up both wings, and there's a little spot which is usually the place where the ice first accumulates, and that's about halfway out the wing where the angle of attack changes. There's a little cuff out there, and the light very nicely illuminates that cuff, so you can see if there's any ice there, which of course there wasn't, but it was fun to check it out. So finally, we started to talk to the final approach controllers for San Jose and get lined up for the airport. And Chuck, tell us what happened there.
So we were cleared to land on the right runway, and a Southwest Airlines jet was about 5 or 6 miles behind us, cleared for the left runway, which was fine. We're conducting our approach, a straight in. And about 5 miles from the airport, the tower asked us to switch runways. So they asked us to do basically a 90-degree turn to the left to line up on the left runway, asked the Southwest Airlines flight to do the same for the right runway. Of course, we're crossing its path, and in the left seat, I'm staring at the giant bright white landing light of the Southwest Airlines plane, all the while hearing the Southwest jet say that he did not have us in sight. That was a little intimidating, but a line we did, and the tower made sure that we stayed apart. Max chose to keep the speed up because he did not want to be landing after the Southwest Airlines plane came through, wanted to stay ahead of the wake turbulence, which I appreciated. The Southwest Airlines jet passed us just as we were touching down, so we managed to pretty much stay ahead of the danger part that was coming with that plane.
Yeah, it was an interesting switch because I think initially he told me to turn 30 degrees right. And as I looked out the left window, I could see that big, huge light bearing down on us. And I thought, the heck with that. So I made it more of a 90-degree turn. And I had already slowed up for the approach. And I put that throttle into full. I decided, you know what, let's get across this final here as quickly as possible. And he was probably at least maybe 4 miles behind us at that point in time. But yeah, when you have those big bright lights staring at you, you want to do whatever you can to get out of their way as quickly as possible.
That's right.
So that actually worked out well because we were headed to a hangar on the left side of the field. So we landed 30 left and taxied over to the hangar where we were not aware, but somebody was going to be arriving there shortly after we got there. So what happened there?
Well, we landed and taxied to the designated hangar, which was quite a large hangar. And at first, no one was out, so we were not sure, how we were going to leave the plane. But you got on the phone and called someone, and they said that they were inside and they would meet us momentarily. So we were met by the ground crew, and within a half an hour, the owner of the plane landed in his own jet and taxied over to the hangar and met us to receive his plane. It was quite spectacular to see him come in full business jet regalia to meet us.
Yeah, it was quite a fun experience, and he was just tickled pink, I think, to actually see the aircraft and to show it to some of his associates who were on the inbound jet with him. And the colors were really spectacular. Everybody commented on the colors. Tell everybody about the colors of this new Cirrus.
This new Cirrus follows what they call, I think, the carbon pattern, and it is a blue-gray. In certain lights, you would say it's a gray plane, and other lights you'd say it's blue. But it's a nice blend between those two shades. It's a gorgeous plane.
I think someone later told me that they called Arctic blue or something like that, which I thought was a good name for it. So yeah, it is one heck of a good looking airplane, and we certainly had a good time doing that. So what do you think? You want to do that again sometime?
Absolutely, I would do it in a heartbeat.
All right. So are you telling me you're still thinking about buying one?
I am thinking about it. I am certainly thinking about it. Of course, they've spoiled it for me. Now there will be no surprises when I go back.
No, I doubt that. I bet they'll find some new surprises. Well, yeah. Chuck, hey, thank you so much for joining me on the trip and for sharing the story here with our listeners today.
Well, thank you for having me, Max. I really enjoyed it.
Great. Talk to you soon. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Now, I wanted to spend a couple of minutes just clarifying a couple of things that came up during the interview with Chuck, and I want to thank Chuck, of course, for joining me on the trip. He was a great co-pilot and companion, and for taking the time to record this episode with me today. Now, a couple of things. When we were westbound from Springfield, Missouri, I mentioned that we were at 4,000 feet and that we were VFR. And in fact, the approach control for Springfield questioned that at one point and said, gee, are you IFR? They wanted to know why we were at that particular altitude. And I told them we are within 3,000 feet of the ground, therefore we're at a legal altitude. And I knew that because by pushing the joystick on the MFD side of the Cirrus Perspective, it instantly shows me the elevation of the ground directly below us. And the ground was a little over 1,000 feet, so I knew that we were indeed within 3,000 feet of the ground when we were at 4,000 feet. Now, if we had been even up at 4,500 feet, which would have been a correct VFR altitude in that direction, we would have lost a substantial portion of our headwind, if not all of it. That's just how crazy the winds were that particular day. So sometimes you can take advantage of the hemispheric rule that doesn't kick in until you're above 3,000 feet AGL to fly what might seem like a non-standard altitude, but which is perfectly legal if you're within 3,000 feet of the ground. Now, it also occurred to me that there is a new feature on the Cirrus Perspective Plus that I'm just not used to looking at. And if I had, it would have helped me tremendously going into Amarillo when I was on the wrong frequency, when I was still talking to approach instead of tower. And that is, ever since the beginning of 2017, in the Perspective Plus and the Cirrus, when you have a frequency tuned, there is a label that appears right below the frequency display that tells you the name of that facility. So in this case, for example, it would say Amarillo Approach, and then if I switch to tower, it would then say Amarillo Tower. So you get instant feedback as to exactly what frequency is dialed up and what facility you are tuned to. So I didn't even think about that at the time, but I'll try and remember that in the future. Now, as we departed Amarillo, Chuck mentioned that eventually we were between layers of clouds, and it was not clear that we would successfully maintain VFR the entire time, which we did. And I agree, it was certainly an iffy strategy, one that we would not have pursued, except that we had several outs, partially because we had a very capable aircraft. So we did have Fiki, flight into known icing capability. I think we would have had over an hour's worth of fluid, and that was going to be plenty of time to divert to an airport if we were picking up ice. We could have climbed to a higher altitude, which definitely would have put us in the clouds and put us into ice, and so we would have used Fiki. We always had the option to make a U-turn, and we also had some bailout airports along the way. For example, we were looking very closely at Moriarty Airport in New Mexico as we flew by that, knowing that we might be coming back to land there, and Albuquerque would have also been an excellent out for us as well. So please don't construe from our conversation today that it's a safe strategy to fly between layers as the clouds. It's not. We got lucky, but we also had a number of different outs available to us, which is why we're willing to consider pursuing that strategy. Now, if we had filed IFR, we might have been in the clouds for a very long period of time, and then we wouldn't have necessarily had enough TKS fluid to complete the trip. But by flying VFR, we minimize the amount of time that we would be IFR if, in fact, we had to go IFR, which we didn't. And then finally, I'm going to post some photos. I haven't done it yet, but do check out the Patreon site at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. I'll try and get those posted up within the next couple of days. And now, if this episode has gotten you more interested in buying a new or slightly used Cirrus, please contact me now so that I can help you learn more about that process. And if you're looking to buy a new aircraft like the one I ferried back with Chuck, let me help set up a free demo flight for you. I specialize in the Cirrus and work with people literally around the world. And by the way, if you enjoy this podcast, please think about a couple of your friends who might also enjoy it, and then tell them how to find this podcast. And until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.